Hi everyone, I'm Cynthia Sanchez from osopinteresting.com, and today we're going to be talking about UTM tracking codes and Pinterest. And what exactly are those crazy UTM tracking codes? Who knows? When it comes to coding and all that kind of stuff, I get like the itches or something because I have no idea what that means. So I thought it'd be a good idea to bring in somebody who really does know what that means. So I've invited Ralph Rivera from Ravelor and also from Web Search Social. He's the owner and co-founder of both of these businesses who help other businesses build their web search and social presence online. Ralph, thank you so much for joining me today for this.
Cynthia, thanks for having me today.
Yeah,
So,
so can you help me make heads or tails of this? I really have no, I mean, okay, so what it does, from what I understand, let me make sure, let
mhm,
me just ask, okay? So UTM tracking codes can help me track my pins in Google Analytics. Is that right? That's what they said.
correct.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Now, how do we do this? Do I need to go hire some high professional, fancy smancy developer or, web guy to kind of help me do this, or web girl? It could go either way. But do I need to have some help with this, or is this something, the average user can do?
Absolutely not. You don't need to hire anybody to do this. It's really, really straightforward and simple. If I were to explain it on a technical level, it would sound really, really complex, but it's not. It's really simple and straightforward to do, and it only involves one step, which is taking your links, running them through Google's tracking tool, and then letting it generate the tracking code as opposed to you having to write it by hand. And that's the part that scares people. People tend to think that they have to do this by hand. They absolutely don't have to do it by hand. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through how to do this.
Okay.
But before we do that, I think the important thing to talk about here is why we would do this. So you and I, we talked before we started recording, and we came up with a scenario where if I wrote an article on my site and I wanted to pin it on my one of my boards in Pinterest, when I look at my Google Analytics, I'll see in my reports traffic to that particular pin. But what happens if I send you the article and I say, hey, Cynthia, can you pin my article to your board? Because I'd like to expose your audience to my article. What happens then? From Google Analytics perspective, all I'm going to see is referrer traffic from Pinterest.com. But if I want to really get into where this traffic is coming from and what specific pins they're coming from, that's why we need to get into this UTM tracking.
Yeah. Currently with Google Analytics, I know I can go in there and see the traffic coming from Pinterest, and then I can break it down into which pin. But then to find out who pinned that, I have to click on that URL within Google Analytics, go out to Pinterest, see who pinned it, and then I can see from that specific pin how much traffic came back to my site. But if I understand this correctly, and you're going to show us an example here in just a sec, I can then assign this code to my pin that I pin to Pinterest. And in the scenario you told me, you could say, hey, can you pin, my article, this this article that you have, but from this pin, and then that I've pinned it, and it'll count the repins because all of that tracking code is attached to that URL. It gets like a whole new URL that's really trackable within Google Analytics, right?
That's right. So let's broaden this just a little bit more. Let's take the example of me writing an article and I want to distribute that article.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to just distribute it on Pinterest. I want to distribute it on Facebook and Twitter, perhaps by email if I'm using something like MailChimp or Constant Contact. I can create a single campaign and then create individual tracking codes for each individual piece of that campaign and track everything as a singular campaign. So
Nice.
instead of going into Google Analytics and then having to drill down and drill down and drill down, I can simply select the campaign name that I've created, and then I can see all of my traffic divided into nice organized categories. Pinterest, Facebook, email, so on and so forth.
Okay.
So
So the campaign in this case is your article.
that's right.
Okay.
It can be anything.
Yeah, it could be whatever. It could be a
Yep.
product or actual a marketing campaign or whatever it is. It could be whatever you want it to be that lives on your website.
Right.
Okay, great.
And if you're doing email, most email applications will do this for you automatically. Pinterest, Facebook, all of these other properties, they will not do it automatically. So it doesn't quite require you to do a little bit of effort, put a little bit of effort into it, but not a whole lot.
Okay.
So let me show you how that works. Okay, let me know when you can see my screen.
I can see your screen.
Okay, so let's start with this article. This is an article I wrote about WordPress and how much a WordPress site should cost. Let's take the scenario where I want to pin this article to one of my boards, but I also want to ask you to pin it to one of your boards. And I want to be able to see the traffic separately inside of Google Analytics. So what we need to do is we need to go to Google's URL Builder tool. The URL Builder tool, really easy to find. I'm not even going to bother telling you the URL because it's a complex URL. Just go to Google, type in Google URL Builder, and this will be the first result that you get. So the first thing that we need to do is kind of take a look at what we have. There are required fields and there are not non-required fields. Unless you're doing something pretty sophisticated, you don't need to worry about the fields that aren't required. So let's just focus on the fields that are required.
Okay.
So first things first, I'm going to go to my article and I am going to, whoops, this isn't the article page. Let me go to the article itself. Okay, this is the actual article page. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this, and I'm going to pin this the same way I would pin any other content. I would just select it. I'm going to put it on a board, marketing and business articles. And here we are on the page. So I've done nothing different so far.
Okay.
So now comes the part that is the extra step. So I'm going to copy the URL of the article, the entire URL, and I'm going to go back to Google's URL Builder. The first box in the Google URL Builder says website URL. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that in there. There's the URL. And then I'm going to fill in all of the required options. Now, I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to jump around a little bit because I think it's easier to talk through when we don't do it necessarily in Google's order.
Okay.
And I'm going to start at the bottom. So the first thing I need to do is I need to give this a campaign name. And I'm going to call this WordPress article. Now, I'm a developer, I'm a programmer. I usually don't use spaces, I use underscores, but you can use spaces. So you can just type in WordPress space article. I tend to like using underscores and dashes, but it's not required.
Okay, good to know.
So this campaign name now becomes a campaign name that I'm going to use for everything that is related to this article, or at least the distribution of this article. So when I'm doing this for Facebook or Twitter or my email campaigns out of MailChimp or Constant Contact, this is the campaign name that I'm going to use. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to identify what the source is for this particular link that I'm creating. And of course, this is for Pinterest. So I'm going to type in Pinterest. Okay. If it was Facebook, I type in Facebook. If it was MailChimp, I type in MailChimp. I want to basically segment my campaign based on the sources that are going to be inbound into my Google Analytics.
Okay.
The third and last required field is campaign medium. Now, this one confuses everyone because if you look at the example in the Google tool, it says marketing medium, and then it gives you a couple of examples. It says CPC, cost per click, banner, email, but those are just suggestions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type my name in here, Ralph, because this link that I'm creating is the link that I'm going to use on my Pinterest pin to track the traffic that is generated from my pin. When it comes time for me to ask you to share the article, I'm going to take Ralph out and I'm going to put Cynthia in here, and then that will be the link that you will use. So gotcha. It's important to recognize that when you create a tracking link, it's not one tracking link, it's one tracking link for every source that you want to track.
Okay, so this will help segment within your Google Analytics when you go to look at it, how much traffic you got from your pin and all of its subsequent repins, because that link
Correct.
will stay with that pin.
Correct.
And when you give me my unique link, that will track how much traffic my pin and all of my subsequent repins have brought back to you.
Correct.
Perfect.
So if I want to ask 10 of my friends to post my article as a pin in their Pinterest accounts, I should really, it's good practice for me to create 10 individual tracking URLs.
Gotcha.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and type my name in here. This will be my pin. And I'm going to click the blue submit button. And Google automatically creates the tracking link. Now, if you look at the tracking link, there's a lot of stuff happening in there. A lot of people like to tweak that and tinker with it by hand. I always suggest to people not to do that because if you make one typo, then your tracking link becomes invalid. So let Google do all the hard work.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to get to the second of the two steps that we need to do. So I'm going to copy the tracking link, and I'm going to go back to my pin. Now remember, I pinned this just like any other content. I am going to now edit the link, or edit the pin rather. And in the source, you can see the original URL of that particular piece of content. I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to paste in the new URL that contains the tracking link. I'm going to click Save Changes. And when I click on this article now, if you look at the URL bar, you'll notice that it's got websearchsocial.com / the name of my article, and then all of the tracking code associated with it. So that means that now any click on my pin will be tracked. And that's important. The tracking code in and of itself doesn't do anything. It doesn't cause any outcome. It doesn't have any effect. The effect takes place when someone clicks on the pin and then travels to your site. That's when Google Analytics actually consumes all of that tracking code.
Gotcha.
So in our scenario here, what I would then need to do now is go back to the campaign medium, type in Cynthia, click submit, and now I have a new code, which is the one that I would basically copy and paste and send to you in an email or a Skype chat or however it is that we're communicating. And then you would use that link, and now it would all be trackable. Now there's a longer effect here. Now that I have my pin in Pinterest, if someone were to repin this pin, that tracking code cascades from repin to repin to repin. So every single person that repins this pin, I will continue to get all of that tracking information. Now you might say to yourself, well, that's not great because now they're all tagged with my name. The source for all of them is Ralph. That's true. That's a kind of a limitation in the technology. But what you could do is you can go into Google Analytics, you can click on the campaign, you could click on the source, which is Pinterest, then click on, drill down into my name. And then at that point, you could actually see individual URLs. So you could see all of the individual Pinterest URLs that are related to my specific source.
Oh, okay. So that could be a way to kind of monitor the amount of repins. And as you're talking about this, I'm trying to see how, I guess it would only apply to one image. So what if you had a subsequent image in that article and you assigned a different tracking URL? Could that be a way that we could monitor, maybe the effectiveness of two separate images within one article?
Yeah, I mean,
or would that be getting down too much and be too confusing?
Yeah, I think that the idea of the tracking code is good, but I think you can do overkill also.
Okay.
There's only so much you want to track that's meaningful. At a certain point, the amount of data that you're then accumulating becomes inefficient and not really necessary. Useful. That's a better word. One important thing I should mention before I forget, the method that we just talked about, the method itself applies to any type of analytics software that works like Google Analytics. However, the tracking code that you would use would be different for a different piece of software. So, for example, if this particular URL builder tool only applies to Google Analytics. If you're using a different software product, a different analytics product, the methodology is the same. You'd still create your tracking code, you'd go into Pinterest, you'd change the source, and then you'd replace the URL. But the tracking code itself, you'd need to get that from whatever software you're using. So you can't use the Google URL builder to build a code for other analytics platforms.
Tools. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So specifically just for Google Analytics, that's the only place we'd be able to use this. So like Tailwind Analytics that is specific for Pinterest, we couldn't do this in their system or whatever. It's not something they have available. Okay.
Right. If they have a similar method, you could use the same method, but you'd need to generate a link different than Google Analytics.
Gotcha. And another concern is rich pins. So rich pins are really valuable for people who have e-commerce sites, who have a lot of blog content, so article pins, even recipe pins. And we did do some testing, and we found that it seems to strip that rich pin data away. What do you think about that? I mean,
so that's let's call it a flaw in the way that this works. So it seems that right now there seems to be an either or scenario with Pinterest. Either you can have your tracking code or you can have your rich pin, but you can't have both at the same time.
Yeah, and our friend Vincent, who we see here a lot on Oh So Pinteresting, who's a
Hmm.
big part of the Oh So Pinteresting family, he found that his rich pin codes came back. And I kind of thought about this a little bit, and I'm thinking maybe it's one of those features that some Pinterest accounts have, but others don't. Pinterest is kind of known for giving some features to some users and other features not to other users. So I don't know if it's part of that, but hopefully
Right.
they can get it all to work together.
Yeah, if you look at Target, Target has, if you look at some of their pins, you'll notice that the URLs have a ton of query string data, which isn't technically tracking data, but it's very similar to tracking data. And they're able to maintain all of that additional information and maintain their rich pin properties. So they're doing both. Now, I don't know if that's a function of the way that their site is designed or a function of Pinterest having rolled out this functionality to some users and not others. I don't know, but in the independent testing that we've done, we haven't been able to get rich pins and tracking code to work in the same pin
Yeah, unfortunate because
yet.
yeah, yet. So hopefully they figure that out and we can get it all to work together because I think that, we'd be missing out on a big opportunity that those rich pins bring us, that
Hmm.
additional branding, that additional information that people like to see. So hopefully it all works out. Well, Ralph, thank you so very much for joining me on this to help make it a little bit clearer. It doesn't seem like it'll be very hard to do. That tool seems very easy and straightforward. So I am going to get started with that and start tracking my pins. Where can people find out more about you and all the great things that you do?
You can find me on websearchsocial.com. You can find my profile and all of my articles there as well.
Wonderful. We'll be sure to send everybody to Web Search Social. Click on the links below to get to Ralph's site and see all the great stuff that him and Carolyn are up to over there at Web Search Social. Thank you so much, Ralph.
Thanks for having me, Cynthia.
Bye. Pinterest is continuing to evolve and change. To keep up with the latest, subscribe to the channel. Or if you are interested in learning more about how to use Pinterest to grow your business or blog, come on over to ohsopinteresting.com. There you'll find tips and tricks and the only podcast dedicated to Pinterest. See you there.